whole arc itself.
Yep. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Open Source Cowboy podcast, where we basically talk about anything I can think of or anything that the community is wanting, or even thought leaders with big industry titles. I'm here with my heavyweight champion friend, Pat Sheridan, CEO of Modus Create. How are you doing, Pat?
Doing great, Christian. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Why don't we get started? Give us a little background about yourself. Everyone knows you from the acquisition of Tweag, and then you helped me pioneer the open source committee. Why don't you give us how you got started?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obviously been a pleasure to work with you and the rest of the folks on the Intersect committees. I think as we were talking leading into this conversation around open source, maybe I'll just kind of frame a little bit of my background about what got me into open source software and some things I think could be very relevant for the Cardano community as it continues to grow. So, just as a predicate, always a software nerd, I think one of the things I really resonated with when we first started talking to folks in the functional programming universe and at Tweag specifically was just the origin story of a lot of founders that, when did you get your first computer? And the people that have been nerding around since before computers had hard drives, before there was an internet, and just the love of programming as just a trade craft and as a creative mechanism. And, as a somewhat self-taught engineer, I got caught up in the early internet. I ended up being the guy that always had to write the company's website and maintain it in addition to my work responsibilities. And that got me to SourceForge and looking at early content management systems, which got me into the Drupal community. And I really, at that time, was just amazed at how within the code base, the comments, but also the forum sites, how many connections I was able to make in these early communities. And things that were taking me days and weeks to solve and struggle on my own, but running into the right person, framing the right question, being able to, submit some kind of code, and getting a hive mind to answer the question in like an hour or less was absolutely amazing. And so as the internet kind of evolved, I evolved into more of a user experience person. So I was looking at how do we bring very dynamic, consumer-oriented front ends into these traditional Web 2 systems. And that got me into a lot of JavaScript, early framework library projects, and the kind of early Cowboy days of the JavaScript open source before Google and Facebook kind of stepped in. And I just loved that community. And I think when we think about kind of innovation and disruption as a function of emerging technologies and open source communities sitting at that forefront, I remember saying to one of my, kind of friends that I've met in this community, why aren't there companies structured like open source teams? Because I have this day job that I'm getting paid to write software now, but the company is politics, all this other stuff. And then nights and weekends, I'm contributing to these open source communities. And it's just an enjoyable experience, and everyone's passionate, and there's a shared culture, and people are all over the world. And this is like the early mid 2000s. So to just kind of land the plane. So at some point in 2010, at the kind of precipice of the mobile economy, I was looking at how JavaScript frameworks were going to have to re-architect themselves for the phone and have the resources or the network bandwidth of the web browser and a hardwired network. And that's really where the origin story of Modus came, that this new class of technologies, and a lot of it open source, was going to enable the smartphone economy because it was going to enable small teams to build apps in months instead of big teams having to build apps in years. And I never thought Modus would become kind of what it became from 2015 to 2020. And obviously with COVID happening, a lot of Modus is being born out of open source ethos. We had a hyper-distributed team, global team, folks in over 65 countries. We evolved from just being kind of hyper-specialized front-end people to full-stack kind of platform approach.
Mm-hmm.
But along the way, really building we didn't really have traditional sales and marketing, we had community engagement. And so if you fast forward that, as Modus really started to grow, and we were looking at what, as a founder and as a kind of a founder out of a technical community, not all founders coming out of a technical community are kind of versed in like just building a software business. It's a whole different set of skills. And so we were thinking about Modus as, could there be a platform for very technical founders that are coming out of the same open source kind of ethos that can integrate all these different things together to add a lot of value? And so in 2021, 2022, we started looking at companies that had a global presence, that were working in highly regulated environments and were coming kind of with an open source, advantage, and found the folks at the Matthew team. And that was kind of my foray into crypto as well, into functional programming. And, again, it's like there was a difference in approach, I would say, whereas Tweag, the folks at Tweag really
had more of like the commercial consultancy versus that research-driven aspect, right? That Tweag was 100%. Doing.
Yeah, and the folks at Tweag were actually like creating projects that they were the core team of as well. Modus, like by the time Modus kind of started to, get a name for itself, folks like Facebook and Google were jumping in and creating Angular and React. So you're not gonna, like, I remember talking to my founder and saying, well, would it really behoove us to try to create an open source framework and put it out there and compete with Google and Facebook? They have way more resources to maintain.
Yeah.
And way easier for them to build a community. Whereas in kind of, when you think about the universe for functional programming language, it's much more niche. And there is a lot of room, I think, for folks, Matthew and team that like at the kind of core of Haskell and Nix and other things. But to your point, it's a very different thing in terms of academic research than in terms of like mainstream market consulting. And so pulling those two things together takes a lot of care and attention, because you don't want to dilute the value, right, of kind of, when you get into some of these communities, there's just it's just a different level. I always would say, like, there's computer science up here inventing software languages, then there's mainstream kind of like scale. Can you help big companies adopt it? And I would say Modus is really good in that software engineering, mainstream core technologies and being part of those communities. And Tweag was like up here in terms of, you need to create a new language to do something. Like, you need to be able to ensure that smart contracts can deterministically prove that they're secure. Then that is a level of computer science that those folks are just very, very well attuned to do.
Well, and to that point, because when I was at IOHK just studying like the nonprofit MBO stuff, which would lead to Intersect eventually, I did get a lot of that commercial grade. And like you're saying, there's no point to like compete with Apache or Linux Foundation. Just join the models, get involved, and use their open source resources to your advantage. But especially when you're getting into the crypto space, where decentralization and projects require their own source method, and they're open source in nature, but not like at a professional grade level as like Google and Amazon, etc. Y'all were, I was definitely inspired by y'all's model, because you turned Tweag into like the OSPO of Modus, and it was able to connect the teams. I know I got to speak with Sarah, yourself, and a couple others as we try to pioneer that within Intersect. Can you tell me kind of that journey? Because I know you're familiar with the To-Do group and like what OSPO should be in the Web 2 environments, but yours is definitely a hybrid model that I think is worthy of some study too.
Yeah, and so, and I think, it's an evolving thing, right? I would definitely say that we got plenty of scars on our back, bumps on our head, learning around the way, but I guess the key is to be able to learn and iterate, and evolve an actual structure. And when you think about a big bank 10 years ago were very wary of incorporating open source software. And even today, you think about things like SBOMs and kind of supply chain attacks, and people are nervous about anything they don't necessarily control or they can't have governance around. And so the OSPO movement, I think, particularly to high regulatory environments, is a structure that allowed a consortium of companies that are not, the big banks will never be as adept, I think, as maintaining technology as a Facebook, a Google, a Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera. But they want to adopt structures. And an OSPO is a structure that provides governance at scale, right? And things where, what is your proprietary code? Things that give you true business advantage, and what are things that are worth sharing to peers in an industry for regulatory compliance, security, baseline things, right? So you're not just say the market wasting resources, everyone doing the same thing. When you then
Yeah.
take that into a company like Modus, or to what you guys are doing in the Cardano ecosystem, and then you just think about innovation, there's this line between what is the responsibility of the core team, like core Cardano, and what is done there that provides a roadmap that lets a community create value on top of that and experiment, right? And what is how do you manage those interactions between? There's a million different flavors to that. What we looked at Modus was this idea that for our customer segment, which is everything from B2B SaaS platforms or startups to enterprise global, companies we would all know the logos of. They all have an innovation problem, which is you can only fund so much internal experimentation. So when you seek to find a partner to help you build things, you want to have a partner that also has its fingers in other innovation. They're bringing learning from the edge into your business. And that was part of the ethos and approach of Modus, which was somewhat intuitive based on us being part of open source communities. But what we formalized into what I would say a differentiator in terms of other consulting companies, a lot of companies that can rent you engineers, right? There's not a lot that I guess can rent you PhDs. That's like a higher bar. But at the end of the day, that's still kind of staffing. But what you want as business is who is increasing the pace predictably of new ideas in your business? Who is increasing the throughput of with $1 million in funding, can we do 1 or 2 experiments or can we do 10? And what's the quality of those experiments? And what partner that can help us both be more efficient in terms of the dollars we put into product development or innovation or disruptive, and who is connecting us and making our brand relevant? And that in many ways, I used to refer to Modus as kind of a bridge in that sense, that the kind of, and think about this in the Cardano ecosystem, the kind of developers that you would want if you're building a real blockchain-based application. That's a small universe of people, and your brand has to be relevant. And I think when you look at what companies are hosting meetups and contributing to the forums or funding an OSPO or getting involved in research projects as part of their culture, not necessarily their go-to-market strategy. What I've said to a lot of big companies is the developers and architects you want to hire, they don't really care if you're a banking company or a healthcare company. They care that you're relevant in a tech stack that they are passionate about. And that by working at your company, they're going to work on relevant projects at the right scale in this industry. And that's what I think, that was my impetus when I first met you and we were talking about Intersect as OSPO and looking at the kind of evolution of how Catalyst funding and other things were helping to develop a community. It's like there are already a lot of patterns that I think work well for anyone building any type of community, but especially within tech communities and especially within open source. The challenges are, how do you maintain continuity? Because it's a marathon, not a sprint. And then how do you direct focus and create priorities? Because in every open source community I've been part of, like I remember even 20 years ago, 20 plus in Drupal, there was probably 20 different community plugins for doing something like event registration. And that's one of the downsides of open source, right? It's like you can, as a new person coming in, you're like, okay, I've got core Drupal, but I want to build an event registration website. But which of these 20, how do I know which team actually updates their code? How do I know which team actually, has the most mature code base? And I feel like that's where the role of the OSPO, the role of, essentially leadership in a community that is consistent and has checks and balances, plays takes the noise and the risk out of these things.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, with our incubation program, we try to set up those risk mitigation. You're familiar with our paid open source model, especially towards the commercial aspect piece of it, but trying to build that sustainable layer that gets rid of risk mitigation. So if you're a business coming in to build, which projects have those sustainability layers and have funding to ensure that they're not going to drop all of a sudden and you need to change your tech stack. But to that, I do think the open source offices, program offices, do help with that value creation engine too, and help sift through some of the SBOMs needed and experimentation, like you're saying. And I know you have extensive experiment or experience in the Washington State area or Washington, D.C. area with incubation programs and stuff like that. Can you talk a little bit about that, how you go sift through value creation? Because I think in Cardano, like we have Catalyst, it's less, it's professional in its own right, but it's more of a throw it out there and see if it gets votes on it versus going through that peer-to-peer review process. I think insights into your experience with those programs would be invaluable for people.
Yeah, and I would actually kind of step back a second first and say that I remember talking to a software architect I met at a open source event at Google years ago, and he was describing that when you think about software, for a non-technical person, all code is code. There's no difference between PHP and Haskell because they don't know. It's just code, right? And when you think about an analogy, even the term software engineer and software architect are taken from this kind of mental model of architecture in the real world. And so he used this really great analogy that was a doghouse, a shed, a single family home, a skyscraper. And when you're talking about building financial infrastructure or voting systems, high integrity system, nuclear law code level system, that is why functional programming languages exist. You are not building a doghouse with Haskell. And so when I think about open source communities and learnability, right? Learnability is an issue. I mean, there is a reason why a lot of people in the Haskell community have a PhD in computer science. And in other communities, you have a lot of self-taught folks just learning how to build a website in PHP. These are two totally different. One is a doghouse, the other is a skyscraper. And so when you look at models that have to do with high integrity software architecture, and you look at things in terms of when do venture capitalists get involved in building a marketplace, right, with a new technology, when does a government level actor get involved? Typically, and I think, like, you know, in the past, we've used the analogy of nuclear program. You know, do you really want a bunch of startups without like, a bunch of safety oversight in nuclear plants? You know what I mean? There's a certain phase of government funding, whether it's things like InQtel, you know, or research grants to R1 universities, that are government programs that are building basic core technology that can sustain an industry with high integrity. So when you think about like the FDA and things like, you know, in terms of medicine and controls, but these are like 20-year plays. And no investor is going to invest today and hopefully get a return in 20 years. They want like 3 to 5 year return. So there's a role of government. And I think in the smart contract space, you know, in the crypto space, the communities themselves have had to play the role of the government entity because ironically, this is decentralized, right? So you don't have a central tax pool so you have to both be decentralized and yet try to mirror some of the structures that allow for long-term investment in high integrity systems. And so when I think about programs that I've been involved in, so I did my master's degree in Washington, D.C., Georgetown, and when I looked at the business schools and what they were teaching in terms of like, you know, they were still teaching a 1990s or 80s mindset in business when you have things like lean startup and all of this kind of like emerging thought for launching businesses quickly, iterating quickly. As I like to say, in this world we live in, the pace of disruption is increased, but also is the pace of commodification. So the second you do something disruptive with some novel thing, it can be cloned in less than a year. So your advantage is really small. And if you look at, just think about LLMs and how fast that's happening, and is OpenAI still at the top 2-3 years later? Their market share, there's like 20 competitors. Right?
US does the research, Europe regulates, China builds it cheaper.
Yeah, that's a great, So when I look at those structures though, so when I think about, there are certain universities that create kind of a bridge where the R1 research is creating the basic technology. Those technical founders are being put in incubators that then try to get them to understand the kind of lean startup product market. You're building a product, not a basic technology. And in order to have an ecosystem and a economy around that, it has to be more than just a technology. And so how do we take the risk out of taking a cohort, right, of technologies and founders and people and focusing that in a way that it takes, say, 9 months to get people through a boot camp? And I think when you look at Y Combinator and these other examples, just taking some of the models that are working on the West Coast, putting them into highly regulated industries, whether it's healthcare, cyber, et cetera, and that there are a lot of kind of lessons learned from those experiences that I think, at least in some small way, I think as our conversation within the Cardano community is like, let's not reinvent the wheel, right? Let's see what has worked over here as a set of structures. How do we kind of bring that in and see where it needs to get, the community needs to evolve it to meet their needs here. And the other part of it too, though, is just the, what I think a lot of companies, they do a lot of what I call innovation theater, where they're doing hackathons, they're doing these kind of events, but they're not really kind of incorporating in that into how money is spent in the company. So when I think about, structurally, let's say Modus or Tweag, these companies historically didn't have a big sales or marketing team. They had massive community engagement engine. And brand awareness, reputation, new client, right, all came through community engagement, more so than traditional sales and marketing, sponsoring events, and other things like that. And if you take a model like that and you try to spin up too much of the other stuff, you're actually now, dollars are competing for hire more, sales people, marketing people, do more community events. And I think this is the balance that companies have to get right, because both have value. But specifically at a smaller scale, right, in a niche community, company under 100 employees, that can work completely. But once your community starts scaling and you start getting into hundreds, if not thousands of employees, you really have to be able to budget and say, this is how much it takes, the overhead. The market has to be this big to warrant an OSPO. An OSPO is going to need a certain amount of funding, so you can have a certain amount of predictable technical working groups that can start something and finish something. And as you know, there are big bets, there are small bets, there are things that you need a consortium of people to work on. There are different scales of problem that you're trying to move through these communities. And, you need to be able to do it in a way where everything is not debated endlessly and you make no progress. And so it's like, there are challenges doing it, just period, but there are also challenges doing it the bigger scale of the problem is, because you can get stuck in administrata, administrata kind of forever. But I do think that that's if I were to kind of be so bold, I would say there are the first is, what is the principal line between what is core, what is the core team and the core framework responsibility, and what is the community? And kind of, knowing that there can be a lot of interest in the community in low integrity systems like, Drupal, WordPress, these kind of things. You can let 1 million people create 1 million versions of ways to, upload an image. When you're talking about the integrity around the smart contract, how do you both maintain decentralized governance and high integrity on things that have high security implications? There is a line where the bar is just higher. And then at the same time, and I think particularly this is what will be interesting for Cardano at all in the age of AI, or AI, vibe coding, let's say, the learning curve. The community is both a repository of knowledge, here's the docs on the code, right? It's a set of resources. Here's example, hello world applications and things that get you into deeper water. And then, ongoing events and education. But then it's the real timeness of, I am working with the current version or an older version of something open source, and there is a framework level bug. What do I do with my application? How do I, get around that? And I often used to say, when you spend a lot of time in these communities and you talk to another developer, you can kind of ascertain in probably 30 minutes how long they've spent, years wise, in a code base, because you start asking questions about, oh, have you run into this issue? And oh, if this is your first 30 days with it, you probably haven't even hit this class of problems, or your app, if your app isn't a, trying to do some like international banking, level, transaction, multi-time zone rationalizations, other things. You're like, whoa, you haven't even gotten into a class of problem, right, yet. And how the community kind of can solve these is a big challenge because it's a lot of upfront work. And it's hard to both build, and I think the higher you go to the skyscraper level technologies, those communities, like to your earlier point, are nested in research universities. They're not mainstream technologies. So we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of developers around the world. And this is an area where, in the early days of GPT, I just kind of sat down on a Saturday and was able to prompt my way into standing up my first Haskell application, having never written in Haskell, as just a thought experiment in how can these tools enable me. And it was everything from setting up the dev environment to setting up Docker containers to deploying, etc. Probably in 4 hours, I was able to do the equivalent of what otherwise would have taken me 4 months of like dedicated, 4 hours a day, trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
And I think has huge potential implications for the Cardano community at all, because this new generation of how to approach technology, obviously, I don't think you're going to vibe code your way through building a full, Cardano application. But for folks that are, kind of running into stumbling blocks, I'm like, this level of code assistance can bring the joy factor in of like, okay, I put some hours in and I struggled to learn something and I got through these things in hours, not weeks. You know what I'm saying? Of back and forth and monitoring forums and other things. And I think that we are going to see a rebound where, this kind of notion that there won't be software engineers 2-3 years from now, people are going to wake up and realize there's absolutely going to be software. I mean, my whole career, Christian, people have been telling me that the next low code thing is going to put me out of a job. You know what I mean? So,
well,
I think like we're at this amazing kind of precipice where lessening the learning curve and increasing the enjoyment factor with being able to be quickly productive. In the early days of Drupal, I remember there was a stand-up Drupal in 60 seconds or 2 minutes. There was a very popular YouTube video that showed like step by step how to get through it. It was one of the first of its kind. And I think that the learnability is one of the biggest, blockings. And I'm curious your thoughts on that, because there's been a lot of energy put into the structure, right, of OSPO. How does it function? How does the money move, et cetera. But then there's also just kind of the community building part, which is more the art, than I think the structure or the science. I'm just curious, like, what's your sense of where all that is today?
Well, especially in the Cardano context. So you already have a passionate community, you already have the technology built by the PhDs, etc. And then you have these people experimenting with it that have kind of adapted themselves to be like in that mid-level, I would say. But setting up the open source practice and then and I'm charged with these core repositories, how do I share the tribal knowledge? That's a big challenge, because now we have to institute a more professional open source culture where it's not just code on GitHub, but getting the actual maintainers themselves to get into a mentorship type mode, but also ensuring that it's not detracting from their corporate ties on the sponsorship piece. And that's where the lovely Treasury can help institute the programs via the paid open source model. But I've also had to define what was the term in the open source world, which is the contribution ladder, get that curated to where it can be a neutral framework for projects to adapt as a different MD file to clarify their ways of working and how people can engage. Pioneering the developer advocate program to give these aspiring people to be technical liaisons to help further those mid-tier people to where they can advance up. And then you get into the reward system with the maintainer retention program, which is taking 100 unaffiliated people and plugging them into the bigger projects and giving them a stipend to actually share the tribal knowledge and making sure we have talent retention. Then you get the Google Summer of Code, which good plug is Tex at the recent Open Source Summit actually met the sponsor for the Google Summer of Code. So we're going to get their formal adoption on our Treasury funded program to get that up and running, to get interns familiar with this stuff. And then if you tie in the Cardano Foundation, Emergo, and IOHK educational resources, I think we can actually pioneer that. But to your point, the other thing is we need to tie in the AI-assisted learning curve. And then through the application testing, make sure they learn the security handling of the code, because you can definitely build an application on stilts, but you need to get the actual structure in place. And hopefully we can accomplish that. It's going to be a massive program test, because I think the treasury withdrawal go in next week officially now. Still waiting on comms, but yeah, it's you have to craft that user journey based on where their shoes are starting from. And then tapping into, you already have 20,000 plus people in Cardano. Everyone's doing their own stuff. Some of them are all open source is kind of the mainstay, but the other problem is they don't know how to monetize on open source, how to build something other than grant structures and everything that's proliferate throughout Web3 communities, but they actually need to mature business models to be self-sustaining rather than relying on good grace of a treasury and stuff like that. Because essentially you don't want your tax money funding someone's company that they can't sell their own ideas.
Yeah, and I think this one, again, I've seen a lot of scars on my back on this for 10 years ago in the JavaScript community, where you have this kind of module-based architecture. You have people building a component, a WYSIWYG editor, whatever, and something that someone could drop in an enterprise application. And while the underlying code base might have an open source version, there's then a paid supported kind of model. And you can get into kind of holy wars. It's a religious level holy wars in terms of what should be worth paying a license for, to get maintenance and support, and what should just be truly open source. And I think that in some respects, some of that conversation has evolved. I think in the JavaScript ecosystem, if you look at companies like Vercel, and essentially it's kind of that Apache model where, okay, yes, you can host all the stuff yourself, but if I'm giving you a kind of a sandbox that has a lot of infrastructure and supports for your application, then you're paying for that, and you're kind of, yes, the open source parts are free if you're mature enough to be able to run all that infrastructure and everything around it, but there's a value added component. And I think that this is kind of the hard one, because there's always a bunch of asterisks on kind of, it depends, you know what I mean?
100%.
And services, like the teams that I've seen that try to do professional services to fund the core team, it's hard, because inevitably, like at Modus, we were writing a book every other year and targeted to enterprise CTOs. And then you actually get a whale jump in your boat, and now you have a risk between everyone that's needed to solve this big chunky issue for a big enterprise customer, or also the people doing the core maintenance, right, of your open source project. And I feel like kind of being able to level out, I think folks spend a lot of time trying to look at how is their monthly consistent revenue. A few years ago, I was in Brussels meeting with the Open Collective folks that, again, I think even ahead of some of the work that GitHub did, in terms of like how people can just do some patron system, but it's taken a long time for these things to evolve, because the sad reality is that there's a lot of thankless work in being a core team maintainer. And when you're looking at other folks working at startups, getting paid a bunch of equity grants, et cetera, or working professional services, getting paid hourly rates, et cetera, and you're hoping that people care enough to donate $100 to $1,000 a time so that, you guys can stay focused. It's not for the faint of heart. And this is where I think that these self-funding mechanisms, or these kind of consortium models that really separate, this kind of, there's enough existing market interest that is willing to take the risk out of their code base by contributing to these, these funding mechanisms, are things that can take the risk out. But I still think it's going to be a work in progress for a while,
Yeah. Well, and with the Ironically, I feel like it was my thought child that carried all this work stream. That's just me having an ego. But when I was thinking of how Cardano is going to do open source sustainability, that's when Germany launched the Sovereign Tech Agency, where they set aside money to solve all these issues. And then you do have GitHub doing some kind of sponsorship program, but there's another interesting one on the horizon that's actually trying to build an investment portfolio that the dividends go back to paying open source projects. So that's a different aspect, but that's if you could tariff your way out of that accidentally. So just had to throw that in there.
Yeah, and it
But
was something we were going to touch on too, which was this idea of the the innovation lab, or like the kind of venture lab component too. And I
Yeah.
think part of it speaks to market maturity. Like, venture capital is money that is willing to take a big bet on something that could be 5 to 10 years, in some cases longer, but I would say generally, in that kind of horizon. And when you think about all the conversations we've had about utility, commercial business case adoption, in the consulting work at Modus, a lot of my time is spent talking to senior executives on what's their business case for AI, or what's your business case for modernization or cloud adoption. Why should a company that for 100 years hasn't considered itself a native tech firm, why should it rethink its entire business model top to bottom as being technology forward? And how does a CFO even fund that? And I do think that as kind of a core pillar to what's happening in Cardano, some of these other ideas that are being discussed around venture incubation and really focusing on how can some true norths be identified, where you almost have like an entrepreneur in residence model, looking at a business case and creating something where there is more of a venture level investment to say the core tech is mature enough to now do this thing that's more market facing. And so much heavy lifting has been done, at least in the last couple of years that I've been involved, just in the coreness of getting the code into open source repos, getting core pillars of architecture out there such that market facing applications can actually grow and thrive. And I do think that that's part of the healthy ecosystem. I mean, back to what you were mentioning about some of my work in DC, a lot of you know how when you go to a lot of tech conferences around the world, like I do, and you'll go to a conference in Eastern Europe and they'll say like, we're the Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe, or we're the Silicon Valley of the Middle East. And at the core, what are people saying? They're saying that in Silicon Valley, it's not just the geography. There is a mature ecosystem for founders to network, to founders to get connected to venture capitalists who also, so you have this like hyper focus, like Nashville's the country music capital of the world. It's like Silicon Valley. It's the ecosystem. And replicating that ecosystem is very difficult. And historically, people would say Silicon Valley started with space program money, right? So again, you have this government level money and geography. And then on top of that, the commercial ecosystem pillars get built. Then you add 30 years of successful business launch. And now you have this thing that every city in the world thinks it can replicate in 2 years. But it's a function of like the law firms, the entrepreneurs ecosystem, and not just entrepreneurs at the beginning of their journey, entrepreneurs that have had successful growth and exits are reinvesting. If you think about like Andreessen Horowitz, these were tech founders that felt that New York financiers didn't understand tech founders. So they built their own venture capital, right, for tech founders by tech founders. And I've seen, like in the 15 years I've been going back and forth to Romania, I've seen a lot of that kind of start as outsourcing, building a tech community, launching your first kind of small native product teams, and then having successful exited founders that come from a place that know it intimately, that are connected to the engineering schools where people are getting trained and the broader tech communities, and reinvesting. And that takes, that's like a 20 to 30 year play. But I do think, and this is this interesting inflection point that we're at, which is there is already an active, the challenge for Cardano, and I think for others, is that there's still a lot of crypto cowboyism, that the serious software architects do not like the bro, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the Web 2, Web 3 dynamic.
That whole thing is very off-putting to serious technologists, and it there's a lot of fraud and waste and abuse and in that universe. And a lot of the attention is just on arbitrage of coin value. But in terms of the winning the long game, like the long game has a couple elements structurally, right? Which again, I think in the decentralized world will be the functional equivalent of what you see in the centralized world, right? In terms of it's not a government authority, but it's a decentralized governance structure. There's a funding mechanism that is, again, based on, self kind of fulfilling, funding mechanisms in the ecosystem. But then the other part that can come quickly is that once that hits a certain point of maturity that maybe we could be 3 to 5 years away from, then it's does this have to launch its own venture arm, or does the kind of TradFi world of venture come into this quickly? And I think you do see some venture capitals that are focused on blockchain or other things, but the question is like, are there other ways to kind of direct capital that could be new and novel and more natively fitting with the ethos, you know what I mean, within the community?
And that's what we're trying to do. At least my mission within my open source area of influence is build that developer ecosystem where there's tie-ins to all the existing resources, so you have less of a learning curve, but then also pioneer Cardano, at least in this current narrative, that it has a world first approach to Web3 sustainability to bring in more of that connection from the Web2 professional world, and then use our connections with the Linux Foundation and Apache and a few others to actually try and get people interested, and then try to see if we can get something to stick. But to your point, even from that, is outside of that paid open source model, you have this whole commercial arm that has to succeed to ensure the sustainability of the whole model. And that's the piece we need to pioneer on. And I know this year we have had a few incubation programs, Draper University, Techstars, and a few others, but we still need that innovation to continue to where you actually are bringing on clients. You were helping with the commercialization working group, but it goes back to your point with the one question I still haven't gotten a solid answer to, which is when do we see Cardano at the inflection point between the tech is ready and the market is willing to adopt?
I know that is a hard one, and I will tell you, look, when I look at my own career, it probably took me, I was probably 15, almost 20 years into my career when the smartphone got released. And I remember looking at that device and thinking, and this is again, just a pure function of when you were born and when you started working and where these tech things were in that whole timeline. But I remember thinking, okay, I've been through this with the computer, like from the desktop, and I've seen it with the laptop. And now this phone is just like the next level form factor, big computer, big desktop to small desktop to laptop, laptop to, handheld. And I remember saying, to Jay, my business partner, we're going to see like a no internet phase of this device, like the PDA tried to be, where you're going to have to plug it into your computer to put apps on it, like the 2G phase. And it's not going to be till 3 or 4G that you could have over the wire, download. And that's going to be a function of, and so we just started kind of laying out these things that said, okay, you know what, in 2010, we were saying it probably won't be until 2015 that you'll have enough 4G bandwidth that is like unlimited data plans that people can afford, that phones are subsidized or whatever, such that 65% of consumers can have this $1,000 thing in their pocket. And that the open source frameworks are going to take a couple of years to rewrite them all for the mobile browser. I mean, think about like WebKit wasn't even coming out yet. And so all of this confluence of things had to come together, but we were able to, in 2010, say, our over under, our Zen, if you will, was like, we'll more likely be closer than we are today. And that's kind of what enabled Modus as a business to say, we're going to be the company focused on the mobile browser and all the open source around that for this thing. I've spent the last 3 years in the Cardano ecosystem, going to conferences, talking to thought leaders, trying to get that same runway. Like you and I talk all the time about, okay, there's certain big things in the framework that folks want, need, stable coin support, other things inside and outside the framework, et cetera. But like, okay, what are the underlying physics that say the, you know what I mean, transaction time speed is here, the, you know, the hardware that's needed to process as the global network speed, like the size of the network, where are those things, and how, where are we here? Are we here on the curve? Are we here and it's just getting ready to go? Or is it, are we still like got a lot of this to go before we get up there? And I do think that the main thing that has changed, you know, since 2022, when I really started, you know, investing a lot of time getting to meet people in this ecosystem, the biggest thing that changed was the AI kind of inflection point of 2023, where the broader community, not just Cardano community, but like business community, had been like, oh, AI, it's over here somewhere, and this kind of chat GPT moment happened. And now every company in the world is rethinking every timeline for everything, because this is coming faster than. And so when I think about like how that timeline could be shortened because of what's happening adjacently over here as AI kind of overtakes, you know, all AI is going to eat all software essentially. I think regardless of what people's opinions are on, is it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it's going to shorten the timeline.
Yeah. Well, every technology innovation typically has half-lifed every single time, especially in the space realm. But to your point, like I was at ServiceNow doing warehouse management and stuff like that, my diverse umbrella of skills. But I was there to help when they acquired a machine learning team, and they had acquired 2 or 3 and then grouped them all together. And now they've gotten rid of whole engineering departments to focus on the AI innovation, just to get ahead of the curve. So
yeah. But I also think, you know, again, some of the other things that have changed is that I just think there's a lot more awareness, you know, for the community. And I do think that the integrity piece, you know, matters. And that that big companies are, when you talk about, you know, hundreds of millions and billions of actual currency, plus transaction values that are multiples of that running on top of a network, this is not something that companies are just going to jump into in a cavalier way. And so I feel like the approach, right, the kind of, why wouldn't you want higher integrity, you know, validated systems, right, this kind of the approach to Cardano, it's one of those things where yes, there's first mover advantages, and yes, there are other existing communities that are larger, but all of that is in this phase that's in the hype cycle phase. When you actually start getting into enterprise infrastructure challenging traditional TradFi ways of doing things, and government awareness and support the more sophisticated approach to how our current nation state government's going to, you know, view these technologies, et cetera, having more of a trusted approach is going to be a market advantage that you cannot just replicate. It'll be very tricky, I think, for newer players to come in and kind of, there's just years of code here, you know what I mean? And, you know, a lot, I can't predict the future, obviously, but again, when I look at my own career and I look at, like, there's a reason why things like Facebook could be built on PHP, right? And there's a reason why the mainframe is still running strong in banking systems. You know what I mean? And there's a reason why hedge fund systems are run on functional programming languages, just pure performance of that. When I think about AI as putting a kind of a democratizing abstraction layer on top of this complexity, and instead of people having to master every step of an architecture to build this type of high integrity system, they just need to be able to communicate effectively with the abstraction layer, and that AI and self-governance and checks within that can enable, you know, what would otherwise be the rookie mistakes that, you know, you see all these people, they vibe code an app and then everyone's hacking their system 2 seconds later when they announce their app on the App Store or whatever. But that the checks and balances and this new way of building and architecting applications, as long as the core components exist, I think that that is going to shorten the timeline to the commercialization epoch that everyone is really trying to, that all these investments are geared to get the community to.
So with that in mind, I'll try to help wrap it up because I know
Yeah.
we're close to time. I think there's four things, correct me or help me reword it, that this whole thing talked about. First one is there's definitely a different cultural and community management side between Web 2 to Web 3, and we need to figure out how to address that and make it to where we can tie the two together for ecosystem success. To that, too, since we are primarily functional languages and we do have a couple other high integrity smart contract languages, we need to embrace a more innovative open source nature to it to help shorten that learning curve and implement AI to help assist that front. The third one is thinking, when you're doing anything or building anything, think of that landscape and the inflection point, and how we as an ecosystem need to try and figure out what are we missing in our Silicon Valley. And I think the SWOT analysis that we worked with on Saman kind of highlights those things and help implement that. And the fourth one, what would you add? It was on your last point here. I lost my train of thought.
Well, I think it's kind of bridging into the other mechanisms that exist. Like, at what point of maturity in Cardano do venture capitalists rush in, right? Because they're bringing that kind of product market fit. Like, we are now ready to spend our capital because this fits our investment paradigm. And is that something that within the ecosystem could be, you could almost spin up your own VC to prove a model to other VCs that we have an incubator, we have a stable tech ecosystem, and we're not going to wait for you guys. We're actually going to invest in a portfolio of things that prove some of the highest value, highest integrity business cases in the ecosystem. And I think that that's where Cardano can essentially hack everything that Silicon Valley has done right in terms of Y Combinator and others, and say, okay, like, we can actually prove that that model could work here with some tailoring that fits to this, ecosystem. But to your point, it brings together the business case, like the business case that someone who doesn't really, is a non-technologist enterprise executive, is like, this is going to make my shipping logistics business run better. And within the community, like the main hurdle of any of these things is really identifying the focus for their like super high integrity parts of the ecosystem, that if you're constantly rewriting those and constantly figuring out, kind of that there's like not enough stability in that roadmap where that bigger things can get built. And then what are the parts where you do want high variability? You do want a lot of people trying to throw a million different kind of experiments at the wall. But then from a business perspective, it's like, okay, now all of this infrastructure is going to solve a real world problem in shipping and logistics, in cap table management, in whatever the business case thing is. And once that hits, and again, there's a class of ideas. This is why you see different incubators within fintech universe, et cetera, because you're talking about building skyscrapers or battleships. You're not talking about building bicycles and mopeds. You know what I'm saying? It's a different level of engineering lift. But I do think that's kind of the piece. And once that bridge gets established, and there is a, when I think about our analogy of Eastern Europe, there was a big the first unicorn company that came out of Romania, funded by other kind of Romanian tech execs. It was that low code UiPath, right? So once you get your first unicorn thing that goes through this infrastructure, that's when then all hell breaks loose, right? And the whole universe wakes up one day to like, Cardano's this new amazing thing, right? The whole 20-year overnight journey. And I think in the meantime, the reality is, I say to my team, is like, in the meantime, you just have to keep marching. It's like, in the meantime, until all these amazing epochs get in, it's like, you have to still build strength and add value every day. And it's all lead bullets, unfortunately. I wish there was a silver bullet thing, Christian, but I do feel like, this kind of something changed in the market between 2023 and now. And obviously the keep marching mindset has built infrastructure that obviously a lot of people have a lot of opinions on, but it's better to have something than nothing. And now the question is, what is the acceleration factor? Are we about to hit a 3x fast forward or a 10x fast forward? And can what we've built to date handle a 10x fast forward? You know what I mean? If we are closer than we think.
Yeah. Well, and our governance going through the test. But to your point too, I think now we actually have a capital available to actually help accelerate these things.
Yeah.
And as long as we play it carefully and it's not just any proposal, anything goes through, we might actually be able to accelerate our timeline a little bit. But money doesn't solve everything. You still have to get the right people in the right room and architect these systems correctly. Because skyscrapers, you can't just. Well, I kind of hope our situation could be like the king in Saudi Arabia, where you can just pay a bunch of money to drop rocks and build a mountain to change your weather. But
yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to get there. Yeah, no, man, this has been a great discussion. I mean, I feel like these are meaty challenges, right? And these are this is not for the faint of heart, this kind of work. And I think that given all the challenges, again, like so long as people keep marching, we're going to benefit from this acceleration, right? That's happening with other supporting technologies that kind of make this. And there's a lot of existing patterns that can be employed to fill in some of the missing pieces. The community part too is I think people underestimate how hard it is to get the right DevRel people, right? I mean, I think, not to reopen a whole can of worms, but, Modus essentially came out of just myself and a couple other people saying, let's just do a meetup in our area because we want to meet other people interested in the stuff we're interested in. And that humble kind of thing turned into us running very big meetups in the JavaScript ecosystem in New York and DC, and speaking a lot of conferences internationally and putting on some of our own conferences. And that was in addition to trying to make a business out of things, right? It was like a full-time job. And one of my colleagues down in Croatia, I mean, was on the road constantly as kind of our DevRel guy. And, having just infrastructure to support that, like people that have time, have interest, and are just really good at engaging other humans and getting people excited, that's also part of the magic sauce. You know what I mean? Is like running that. And I think, unfortunately, there have been a lot of challenges in open source communities that get hyper politicized, or there's the community itself, kind of, there are trolls that want to attack and eat their kind.
Oh, yeah.
But again, I do feel like in this, this is what enabled previous models to take off. And part of that is like having good documentation, having good community forums, having learning resources and these other kind of investments, and just getting people and supporting this native community movement that happens. The movement building side is really where the magic happens. And some of that kind of momentum, I feel like, continues to build year over year, which is great.
Well, and it goes to your point, be my final mention, is like open source, yes, code on GitHub, but you need someone to force an open source culture and lead that pioneering movement. That's why we dropped the OSPO, or at least the P in the OSPO, and just built an open source office into an open source nonprofit to force a vibing community and to help manage and steward things that way. I mean, what better way than just to put your hands on it and muscle through it?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you got to write that code.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your time and joining. Any final one sentence mention to anybody joining Cardano, getting involved, or wanting to dabble in AI? You can pick your topic there.
Wow, that's a lot there. I mean, I've always said to people ask me, how do you develop a career in technology? I talk to a lot of young folks that are saying, should I even do software engineering? And I always tell people the same thing. I'm like, build something for yourself. Like, I always had a pet project thing, even if it was my own personal portfolio website or just a game. Like I really, gaming is what got me into programming. And that's the thing. Like, as long as you have your own personal project and open source it. And when you run into a problem, that is your predicate for learning, right? And kind of doing that. And I feel like my hope, for kind of the next generation of tech nerds, like us, is that we have so democratized tools the barriers of like needing years and years and years. I mean, I remember my first computer, I got like 3 big books on basic programming. There was no I had to read as like I'm 10 years old, 1,000 lines of basic programming to do a game. And we did. Like, that's the level of like self-motivated interest and direction. And I think there's so many resources available. It's almost like any objection someone would have, it's like, no, man, just power through. Come up with your own thing, build selfishly. And then that's going to get you into a very authentic way to get into the community, start asking questions, seeing who's relevant, seeing other things that you want to be involved in. And from there, you can self-direct any future that you want, really.
Yeah.
Well, so jump in. That would be my advice, man. It's like sometimes you can't dip your toe in the pool. Sometimes you just got to jump in the deep end and you're better for it.
It's highly relatable. My last cowboyism, and this will be my last one. If you see a truck, rather than paying mechanics to build stuff and do the custom stuff, get involved, find out what shocks, what kind of suspension system you want, what your future vision is, and then you can have something that you built, take pride in as it goes 800 miles through the desert jumping. So
yeah.
Pick your
well, listen, man, thank you, Christian. It was always great to chat with you. Yeah, I look forward to seeing you at Rare Evo.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Pat.
All right, cheers.